Hey, this is Mr. Spencer. We are talking about The Great Gatsby, and we're summarizing and walking through the first chapter. In chapter 1, meet Nick Carraway. All right, this first part, just overviewing the whole first chapter, and then we'll go into the details. All right, the narrator's Nick. He's a pretty fancy, upper class, honest and normal guy, he claims to be. But he wants to tell us about some weird stuff that happened surrounding his neighbor, Gatsby, who was unlike anyone he ever met. But first, all of the events leading up to this Gatsby drama started in the summer of 1922, after Nick just moved into a small little house on the super rich new money part of Long Island, New York. And he visits an old college buddy of his, Tom Buchanan, who's married to Nick's second cousin once removed, Daisy. Tom and Daisy haven't seen Nick in a while, and they're a bit full of themselves, and introduce Nick to their famous golfer friend, a tall and intimidating woman named Jordan Baker. Okay, that's everything we're introduced to in the first chapter. It might not seem that important from the first chapter, but trust me, by chapter 3, 4, 5, these details will become more important. So let's go into the details. Chapter 1. Nick Carraway introduces himself as a non-judgmental observer of other people who has recently returned to his home in a wealthy Midwestern family from the East Coast after a devastating disappointment, vaguely. This disappointment in the story he's about to tell, which happened 2 years before. After graduating from Yale and fighting in World War I, Nick decides to become a bond trader and moves near New York City, selling stocks and bonds on Wall Street, investments. Nick rents a house in West Egg, a Long Island suburb that is less fashionable than East Egg. They're shaped like an egg, like peninsula, and it lies right across the Long Island Sound. Okay, the picture here shows that bay, the water, the sound. His tiny, cheap bungalow is next to Gatsby's enormous, tacky mansion. Nick goes to have dinner with his cousin Daisy and her extremely rich husband, Tom Buchanan, whom he knows slightly from Yale. Their house is overwhelmingly decorated. The color white is emphasized a lot. Tom is gruff, aggressive, and physically intimidating. He's a former football player. Daisy and her friend Jordan Baker are wearing white dresses that look like balloons in the breeze. Daisy laughs a lot and speaks in a low, extremely appealing voice. Their conversation is scattered and shallow, and everyone talks over each other. During dinner, Tom suddenly reveals himself to be a racist, influenced by a book he read that argues that the dominant white race is in danger of being overwhelmed by minorities. His wife Daisy sort of mocks him, saying he reads lots of big words, big books. Anyway, the phone rings for Tom. After he goes to answer it, Daisy seems upset and leaves the room. Jordan tells Nick that the phone call is from Tom's mistress in New York. Is he cheating on his wife? The rest of dinner is tense and awkward and makes Nick feel like he should call the police. Remember, Nick hasn't seen Daisy and Tom in many years. After dinner, Daisy takes Nick aside and tells him that she's become cynical. Nick asks Daisy about her 2-year-old daughter. Daisy doesn't seem to have any maternal or motherly feelings. When she found out that she'd given birth to a daughter, Daisy's first reaction was to cry, she says. And she hopes her daughter will grow up to be a beautiful fool, on page 17. A beautiful little fool. What more can a girl be in the world, she says. Despite the fact that Daisy seems to be bearing her soul to her cousin Nick, Nick thinks that this display of misery is some kind of act. Daisy and Nick, they rejoin Tom and Jordan, and Nick realizes that Jordan is a relatively famous professional golfer. He's seen her in magazines, and he's heard an unpleasant story about her. After Jordan goes to bed, Daisy matter-of-factly tells Nick to start a romantic relationship with Jordan. Tom, meanwhile, tells Nick not to believe anything Daisy told him when she took him aside. Who can he trust? Tom and Daisy asked Nick about a rumor that he was engaged. Nick denies it. This rumor is actually one of the reasons that he's come east. Nick leaves the house confused about why Daisy doesn't simply take her daughter and leave Tom. However, he can see that she has no intention of doing so. Back at his house, Nick sees the figure of Gatsby, a silhouette, a shadow, outside his mansion. On page 21, Nick thinks about introducing himself, but refrains when he sees Gatsby stretching his arms out toward a green light on the opposite shore of the bay. Okay, this first chapter, we meet these characters here. And where is this so-called Great Gatsby? He's a shadow, he's a silhouette, he's standing on the edge of a dock, but Nick doesn't talk to him, Nick doesn't see him. The narrator is not Gatsby. The person telling the story is this unassuming guy named Nick. Okay, that's the mansion that apparently Gatsby lives in, and then Nick has this little house right next to it. Okay, that's like the tiny little bungalow. This is the end of chapter 1 summary. I'll go over in the next video what happens in chapter 2. It gets a little bit more drunk.